A little earlier, I spoke to Donald Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, and I asked him to put Putin's threat to Ukraine into a historical context, to assess the dangers that may face us.
Well, I think it's very dangerous in large part because Putin is looking at this through a strategic framework that neither the United States nor NATO, I think, are responding in an appropriate way. I think he's looking at a range of options. I don't think he's made up his mind finally on what he wants to do because he's still doing a continuous cost-benefit analysis. But I think his aims range from dividing NATO, driving wedges between the allies, at which he seems to be succeeding, reducing American influence in Europe, putting a squeeze on Ukraine in a number of respects, or it's possible he's playing a shell game. And while we're looking at Ukraine, he's looking at Georgia, Belarus, someplace else. And even in Ukraine, he's got a range of options. He's not limited to an all-out invasion and take over the country. He may be satisfied toppling the Zelensky government. He may be satisfied taking another big chunk of Ukrainian territory and putting it under Russian control. He's got the momentum. He's got the initiative. We're responding. I don't think we're deterring him effectively. I think it's very worrying.
I mean, our Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the retaliation from the West, from NATO, should be extreme economic sanctions. Is that enough?
Well, I think that would be great if it happened. I think the problem is Putin doesn't believe any of our threats, not just Boris Johnson's, but Joe Biden's or anybody else's. In 2014, he was threatened with economic sanctions if he did anything in Ukraine, and he responded by annexing the Crimea and by putting a big chunk of eastern Ukraine under effective Russian control. He's heard it before, and he doesn't believe it. And I think particularly in the current circumstances, I think the American withdrawal from Afghanistan was a tremendous strategic mistake, and I think its reverberations are being felt in the current crisis. I think our collective effort has been to threaten punishment to Russia if they invade, and that has failed or is very much in danger of failing as a deterrent because we're not imposing costs on Russia right now to prevent the invasion, not simply to promise punishment later.
So which country or countries do you blame in particular for this failure to take preemptive action?
Germany. And, you know, of all the countries in Europe that should stand strong against military force being used to change international boundaries, you would think it would be Germany. And yet we've seen nothing but weakness. This is the division within NATO that Putin sees, and he's going to try and exploit it.
Is it mostly about oil and that new pipeline, the gas pipeline?
Well, I think that's a factor. But look, much of Eastern and Central Europe depends on Russian natural gas. It is wintertime. Putin has picked his weather accordingly. But if Germany were to stand up and do the right thing and say, for example, the Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 2, is canceled effectively immediately, unless and until all Russian forces in countries that don't want them are removed, like Ukraine, like Georgia, like Moldova, just for starters. That's the kind of pressure you need to put on Putin right now, before his troops cross an international border. It's better to stop it than to threaten punishment, and yet we're effectively precluded from doing that because of Germany and their weak attitude.
Should we be sending, or should we keep as an option, sending troops into Ukraine?
Absolutely. This is another thing I would have done. We're very late in the game here, I think, unfortunately, but I would have done this much earlier. I would have put more U.S. and NATO forces in Ukraine, not to fight, but to train and work with their Ukrainian counterparts, and to give the Russian generals across the border something to think about when they look through their field glasses into Ukraine and see a lot of American flags and say to themselves, wonder what that means.
And so we haven't got a lot of time. I've got two final questions. One, some would say the risk of concerted Western action of the sort that you are proposing is that you simply drive Russia into the arms of China and you create, in some ways, a much more dangerous bloc.
Well, I think Russia is running full speed into the arms of China right now. I think that is, over the long term, a huge mistake for Russia. But what the steps we're taking now are not going to speed that up. And if you're worried about that, tell me the answer to this question. How much of Ukraine do you want to give to Russia? And then
finally, yeah, I mean, as you say, that is not a choice anybody rational would want to make. And then finally, you've been critical of Trump, you're critical of Biden. Who would handle this crisis better?
Well, I wrote in the name of a conservative Republican for president in 2020. I've never revealed the name, but that person could handle it better.
OK, you're not backing either of these two. Listen, as always, very good to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.